Hey secreters! So I wanted to go over some Wandering Wednesdays with you, if you will. Starting with the beginning of the secret book with the French. So looking at the original manuscript, what was given out to Joellen and John Pirard and Ben and everybody to kind of read over before the final printing of the secret book. So in this book, or in this specific section, we have an interesting couple of changes. So I know I had mentioned earlier, I'd posted something about, I think it was the Lutins of Normandy, the shapeshifters, if you've seen that post this week. But I wanted to read this to you because I want you to really kind of process what Byron is saying here. In the printed version, he says, the French were the first to follow. The tall, proud Haydas of Spain had already departed, however reluctantly, with their diminutive domestic relatives, the Duendes. So, then he says, from France came the sturdy seafaring cords of Brittany, the nomadic shape-shifting Lutins of Normandy, Dames Blanques, Dames Vertes of the coquettish maidens of the river valleys of the Aquitaine, the Loups Garreau from the forests. All of these found refuge from the onslaught of man, unbelieving and unbelievable, upon the chill and rocky northern coast of the Newfoundland, across the sea, forsaking the suntan Riviera, the water dracs, which is French for dragon, playful as porpoises, and the languid amorous Fairies found contentment upon the hot southern shores of the New World, amidst pink, long-legged birds and high-swaying palms. This section is so interesting because when you look at what was printed and then you look at the original manuscript, you have what is saying in the original manuscript, the French were the first to follow, the seafaring cords of Brittany. By the way, where is Brittany? That's Britain. We're talking about Roman-held territory called Brittany, which then begot Great Britain. So then you have the nomadic shape-shifting Lutins of Normandy, which were Vikings in 1204 conquered by France. So Normandy, the term Normandy comes from Norman, which comes from the Norse. So then you have Dames Blanques, Dames Vertes from the river valleys of the Aquitaine. Well, the Romans, they held that area too until 1204 when King Philip of France conquered them and took it over. But before then, it was full of the Visigoths, the Franks, and the Carolingians. So we have all of these, and those were from the forest apparently. All of these found refuge from the onslaught, cottonwoods, the onslaught of man upon the chill and rocky northern coast of the Newfoundland. So here we have all of these mentions of Corrids from Britain, the nomadic shape-shifting Lutins of Normandy, which were originally Vikings and the Norse and the Normans. How are all of these French? And what time period is Byron referencing whenever he's mentioning these? Now, these carried over into the final print of the book. And so this is why it's important to understand what time period of history we are truly looking at. When you first read this, it's super easy to skim over it and say, oh, the French were the first to follow. And then it says in parentheses, the tall, proud Haydas of Spain had already departed, however reluctantly, with their diminutive domestic relatives, the Duendes. And we'll get into that because why? We start talking about who were these Spanish people? Well, there's a great beginning of the book that talks about Colon Savinelli, right? He was paid by the Spanish crown to go seek out the Spice Islands. Very easily could be discussing Christopher Columbus and the other little well-known conquistador that was on his boat at that time that sailed with him, which I'll let you figure that one out because I'm pretty sure that's the duende that Byron's talking about. But going back to the French, we have all of these things listed here, but they all became France at different times. So, Cords of Brittany, Brittany's Great Britain, right? That's where it gets its terminology and its name from, which is the origins of Romans, right? So, technically, we're talking about Roman controlled areas. So when you look through the book and there's different references to the Romans, he could be specifically trying to pinpoint back to that Corrid fairy, and make you look there. It could be an instance of looking for something that is related to maybe the British or the English cask. So when you're reading, the biggest thing is to not make assumptions based on what you read. When you're reading, you have to deconstruct the words. What do the words mean? What words is he using for certain areas, certain geographical areas, right? Because we have Cords of Brittany, that's Britain. But he said, from France came the sturdy seafaring Cords of Brittany. So that could be a time period that you need to look at for a clue. It's possible. The nomadic shape-shifting Lutins of Normandy. Well, when was Normandy taken over by the French? I mean, 1204, it was conquered by France. And that would have been about a couple hundred years after King Olaf. So I'm pretty sure, because King Olaf was there around 1001. I need to look back and see how long his reign was, but again, that's where that coin, what is it called? The Augustus coin, the Augusta coin that's in Maine, where they had done some archaeological digging, a little Josh Gates flair there for you, and found that coin that has his imprintation on it for King Olaf, which is indicative of some trade that had potentially gone on with the northern indigenous tribes of Maine with the Norse. Anyway, so when we go and look at Lutins of Normandy, we're talking Vikings. Dames Blanquez and Dames Vertes from the river valleys of the Aquitaine. So Aquitaine's interesting too, because Aquitanian language, an old Romance language, kind of got its basis from, forms its base in Provençal, or the province of southern France. So then you go, and Aquitanian is the language that the 11th through the 13th century troubadours used as well. I want you to look up troubadours and you can figure out what that is. So we're looking at these things and we're reading it, but are we really absorbing the context? And that's the question I have for you today. That's the question I have myself in general, is are we so quick to make the assumption when he says from France came all of these things, but the reality is which specific one came from France? Because all of these were not always France. Okay, we took over the Romans, 1204, King Philip, France conquered the Aquitaine. And in that area, we had the Visigoths, the Franks, which is essentially where France gets its name, from the Franks. And then you have the Carolingians, all right? So we have these other kind of cultures of people in this Aquitanian area. And so then we have to ask, well, Byron, which French fairy are we actually looking for then, right? which one is truly French? That's what we have to figure out. If people want to make the claim that the beginning of the book is so much more important than the rest of the book, well, then we have to be able to connect the dots. And that means we have to figure out, is he actually talking about the loups-garous from the forest? That is a true French folklore piece, fairy tale, werewolves. Although werewolves do actually get some of their origins in, I think it is Sweden or Switzerland. I think it's Switzerland. You have to check me on that. But point being, when he mentions some of these places, is he expecting us to figure out truly which places he's talking about? That's my question of the day. And I think that there is a lot more study to go on here. I mean, when I saw Chords of Brittany, I thought, well, this is confusing to me because Brittany is actually Britain. So what time period? Are we looking at the time periods that France had conquered some of these areas and then went back in through, you know, some treaties later on, and then they gave back some land and drew some lines, and, you know, what pieces here all fit together to point to the specific French fairy or fairies? In the manuscript, Byron instructs Joellen to, when she's working with the French cask, to essentially think of werewolves and that kind of thing when she's designing that portion of the cask, which then would tend to lend me to believe that we're potentially looking for a loups-garous. And in that light, where were the loups-garous? The forests. What particular parks would be around certain forests? And are these French named forests? You know, when we look at, let's just throw it out there for fun. If we say the French cask is potentially New York. Now I know, don't get crazy. Don't call me crazy Karen. But just for a moment. You know, you have some very wealthy French families, you know, Astor being one of them, which was French. You know, we have so many ties to France. We have the Maitre Damon, who is obviously one of Joellen's favorites and very French in nature. And really in the 1980s and 81, you know, French fare was really becoming a very hot and popular thing. And I think I've spoken about this before, but there is a few of the French chefs that came over and inspired some of the greatest French restaurants, even in New York. One in Hell's Kitchen. Then he moved on to the Watergate in Washington, D.C. And of course, you know, when we think about some of the most important French people in American history, the key figure that's mentioned in the secret book and comes up is Lafayette de Marquis Lafayette. So how do all of these things play a part? Or do they? Are they lessons? Are they clues? These are the things that we have to kind of mull over in our minds and not always take the allegory for face value, because the words could mean something completely different. I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on it. And leave me a message and let me know with some comments and we can chat about it. I appreciate all the comments. I'm going to be doing a AMA session in the next 2 weeks. Ask me anything and we can talk about some of your ideas. And maybe try to kind of put our heads together to figure out where some of these boxes still may remain. And the cryptic wording that is written here. And it's done in a tricky way, I believe, on purpose. And so we just have to figure out what that purpose is. So until then, until next time, ferry on, guys. Keep your brains going. Keep your theories going. Keep them fluid. Have a few. None of the cities are confirmed. And I'll say that until I'm blue in the face. You know, Ben and JJP and John Pirard and the creators that are around today have indicated in more ways than one that there's multiple possibilities. So let's stick with that and let's keep looking. So until next time, fairy on, guys.